Welcome to the 10th episode of Shot Nostalgia, where we continue our drive back into the history of wrestling and fully immerse ourselves in a timeline. We are continuing our journey through 1996 WCW and continuing to relive one of the most memorable years to be a wrestling fan. As always, I'm Stephen Acefield, the ace of the Tavern, joined solo today. No Mike Bellcaster, some HollerNet issues in Denver, so I'm here on my lonesome doing the go-home show before SLAMBOREE, but don't worry, he will be back next week. But I wanted to play a clip of him, the old intro we used to do, just to have Bellcaster's feel in here as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am Mike E. Dangerously, and you're watching Shot of Nostalgia. Let's get extreme!
We missed about carry on that weight here with Shot of Nostalgia because the show does go on. And just to take care of some housekeeping, guys, off go these show sunglasses because I'm here to stay. I got my pin on here, Shock the World. We got the Shockmaster pin. Every week I'm going to be wearing a different pin here. Hopefully something to do with WCW. But happy Friday to everybody. Make sure to go like and subscribe to the Turnbuckle Tavern. Take care of some shilling here since I'm here by myself. The turnbuckletavern.com has all your needs. Join the community. We are on all these platforms: Pro Wrestling Tees, Teespring, Discord, Instagram, Twitter. Find us where you can. Support us. Even if you're not on those platforms full time, just go on there and like them. Make an account, support us. It goes a really long way. And if you'd like to buy a shirt, of course, you get a Shot of Nostalgia shirt on Pro Wrestling Tees. We have our own store. Check out that Tavern Daddy shirt. The flagship episode just dropped yesterday morning. And man, what a show it was. Support us in any way you can. Buy some merch, support the Tavern. And of course, we have those exclusive tees over at Teespring. Buy one of those shirts. You can get the Anti-Taskmaster shirt. Shot of Nostalgia merch is flying off the stands. Make sure you guys check it out. And of course, we have that go home shirt we need to talk about. Main thing is leave a 5-star review, guys. Let's get into it. Today, we are going to be reviewing the WCW May 6th episode and the May 13th episode of WCW Nitro. As you guys know, each week we will be reviewing an episode of Nitro, maybe a pay-per-view, potentially a Clash of Champions. We dabbled with potentially doing 3 episodes at once, but that episode, as you guys know, went like 3 hours. We want to make sure it's a nice, tidy, hour 30, hour 20. Make sure you guys can fit it in. We want to get your weekend started, but this is all truly a Shot of Nostalgia. If you guys would like to jump into the process, make sure you guys are watching the episodes with us. Check out on our Instagram, or mine specifically, we have the schedule that you guys can check out. There is the full rundown of from now until November when this journey's over. This is a big, big episode of Nitro we will be talking about. And of course, we're going to get into the newsletter first because it's happy hour, guys. Grab a drink. Let's all relax and let's talk the news in May of 1996. All right, as always, we are diving deep into the Wrestling Observer newsletter from 1996, and the best thing is these have been dropping on Mondays, which coincide perfectly with our Nitros. So the first newsletter we're going to be reviewing is, of course, by Uncle Dave Meltzer, May 6, 1996. And we start with the guy who will be showing up on our next episode. We'll be talking about his existence and change the whole landscape. We had Diesel and Razor Ramon were giving their send-offs on pay-per-view before they leave for WCW that would be classified as far less than burials. So while Ramon also did the job on the show, putting over Vader, he was giving a great deal of offense in the match to look more competitive than most would have figured under the circumstances. In the post-match commentary, McMahon went out of his way not to bury Razor Ramon and actually did quite the opposite of praising him for his performance. It appeared that McMahon was trying to do the exact opposite of what he thought Eric Bischoff would do in the same situation. So we saw a lot of guys get buried on pay-per-view or on the Nitros prior to their departure. Vince trying to take the high ground here. And we have, obviously, they're leaving. We know it's happening. It's all over the newsletter, but it's official as of next week. We're going to see the emergence of Scott Hall that will truly change the landscape of what we've been seeing in WCW. It's been happening progressively, and you guys have seen it over the course of the beginning of 1996 until now. His emergence, and then eventually Kevin Nash, when they come in together, that marks a huge change in the way the booking is starting to work, with realism taking hold of the storytelling. And this was interesting here that McMahon was taking the high road because it has been very petty. As we've noticed every week inside of the newsletter, we see a lot of pettiness going on between both parties, one trying to get one up on the other, whether it be the Nacho Man stuff with the billionaire Ted skits, or whether it be Eric Bischoff going to any magazine, news publication that will listen to him to talk about steroids and WWF and everything in between. So we know that the relationship isn't getting any better, but it is interesting to see Vince taking the high ground here. But maybe he's holding out hope that eventually we would see the return, and we do eventually see the return of Scott Hall. All those years later, he finds his way, as everybody does, back into the WWE, finds his way home, but it takes a while. And I don't think Vince truly knew exactly the impact they would have on the WCW landscape. So continuing the conversation here in the newsletter, the time slot change from Monday Nitro due to the NBA playoffs on TNT is going to leave WCW destroyed in the ratings battle through late May. Doesn't this sound familiar? This is the same battle that AEW is battling right now between Rampage and Dynamite. We saw the NBA playoffs absolutely annihilate the ratings, and a lot of people just disregard the ratings because of the fact that those things exist. But it is something to note that this has been a problem for a very long time. Wrestling and live sports is direct competition, whether they know it or not. I mean, we talked about it on the wrap-up show last week. There was a huge, cause for concern with the Rampage ratings, and we talked about it. We can all talk about why it's happening, whether it be the fact that it's taped, whether it be just they're not giving the content they want, or the time slot, whatever it is, it's not doing a good job of getting people to watch the show. And it's not like people are not tuning in to wrestling. We saw a huge number for SmackDown between the Reigns and Riddle match. So if you give people a reason to watch, they do watch. And wrestling fans, they're a loyal bunch, so they will watch. But there's no doubt that even in 1996, the NBA playoffs were playing a large part in diminishing ratings and making, sponsors concerned with who was watching the show. So going live the day after the pay-per-view and unopposed with Ultimate Warrior versus Isaac Yankem on top, the WWF posted a 3.9 rating and 5.6 shares on April 29, tying in second highest rated Raw in history. WCW, despite getting the word out about having a world title change, headlined its show in its new time slot, drew a 2.1 rating and a 3.9 share. There was no replay showing because the playoff games went long. Raw actually outrated the NBA playoffs, which isn't really unexpected, as pro wrestling does better than NBA and cable, which is a crazy thing that Meltzer's saying here, because that is so not true anymore. So just want to note that we eventually will see the change in the tide, and that has a lot to do with the NWO and Hulk Hogan's heel turn and Scott Hall coming in, but just shows that WWF still had a lot of momentum on its side, that they had a lot of leverage, and despite them feeling like they're hurting and the programming is kind of becoming stale. If you watch WWF in 1996, you will know what I'm saying, that it's a change in the guard, but WCW is about to get super hot over the next couple of weeks. And when Bellcaster gets back here, we will certainly kick off that Scott Hall era. It's a huge thing to talk about. But moving on, as you guys know, we've been talking about that World Peace Festival that's been trying to be booked by Antonio Inoki, very, very in accordance to what we've been talking about with Forbidden Door. So this Forbidden Door is happening in 2 days from now on Sunday, live on pay-per-view, where we have AEW, New Japan coexisting on pay-per-view. And here, I'm sure a lot of the same issues are coming up in person with the booker, with Gato, Tony Khan, and all the officials in that company as well, because somebody has to win. And I think a lot of the issues we're seeing in the newsletter pop up and throughout the history of these events that are so, a collaborative effort, you have to figure out a way to balance your top stars and their top stars and who's going over. And I'm sure that is a cause of concern, at least a conversation between Gato and Tony Khan. But it is interesting that it is in the newsletter here. So as we know, Antonio Inoki held a press conference in Japan on April 25th, where he announced the official World Wrestling Peace Festival that will take place on June 1st in Los Angeles, and gave basically the same lineup we've been listing all along here in the newsletter. The only difference is that Inoki announced the main event of himself and Dan Severn versus Fujiwara and a mystery partner instead of Craig Pittman. He also announced that Jushin Liger versus Wild Pegasus, who we know is Chris Benoit under a mask. So I guess the problems between WCW and New Japan over that specific match have been straightened out. The two changes were the Conan and a Gaio match, and also the six-man match with Tatsumi Fujinami and Black Cat on the retrospective teams. The card is ever-changing, and the fact that WWF is not participating is a absolute huge blow to what's going to be going on here. They thought this could have been a game-changing, landscape-changing, and potentially we had a whole episode discussing what this could have done if this would have actually come to fruition, if both sides could have came to the table and came to agreement. If you got WCW and WWF to work together, we could potentially be looking at a different wrestling world. And that's not hyperbole. I think that's a true fact. I think what Antonio Inoki was trying to do here was in good spirit, because at the end of the day, it was supposed to be a festival similar to Woodstock, where there would be a gathering every single year of wrestling fans. A different experience than WrestleMania. It was more a festival feel. We see some of that sort of spirit in StarCast, which started a couple years ago with Conrad Thompson and all that, because people like to gather and have an eclectic mix of activities based around what's going on. So I think Inoki was ahead of his time, but I don't think the wrestling business was ready to actually consider working collaboratively together, especially with the tension between WWF and WCW. So he continues in here talking about just the matches with New Japan and WCW, and obviously AAA is involved here as well. But we know the card doesn't shape out to be exactly what it could have been, and that's a problem. So, we'll talk more about it as it comes up, because right now we are at the mid-May juncture of 1996. I'm sure it will continue to pop up in the newsletter. And then the fallout following the success or not so success of the ratings, and also the buy rate, and also the attendance and how it did at the gate. So I'm curious to see what he has to say about that. And then we can also compare it to Forbidden Door and how that does. I mean, there's been a lot of good talk about what's going on at Forbidden Door, and there's been a lot of bad luck about what's going on there as well with all the injuries. So, two very similar situations for different reasons. I think Forbidden Door, they're making the best of it, but there's no doubt that the card is not what they want it to be, just like Inoki and the World Wrestling Peace Festival was not what they intended it to be either. So maybe Forbidden Door next year, if they want to make it an annual event, it could actually have the impact it may have had this year. So we shall see. But moving on into the more in the newsletter, he just discusses that upcoming Nitro cards are May 6th in Daytona Beach, which we will be talking about tonight, with Sting versus Steve Regal, Savage versus Hugh Morris, Juice and Liger versus Demolenko, and Giant versus Luger for the title. And on the 13th, we have the Giant versus Luger for the title, the Steiners versus Public Enemy, Chris Benoit versus David Taylor, and Flair versus Wall Street. Just mentioning that because it is pretty dead on as far as what the cards are, and he nails it here the day of that. 2 weeks out, we have exactly what the card is. Just to kind of further prove Meltzer is pretty much has his finger on the pulse of what's going on in WCW for the most part. And I will point out some things he got wrong. There was something very glaring he got wrong in the newsletter. I think people would appreciate, because it's so far off. And who knows, maybe it was the plan all along. Maybe we actually had that penciled in and things did change. Plans do change, but it was very interesting to read because he was so confident, but we'll get to that in a second. So as we talked about, unfortunately, Brian Pillman last week, with the car accident, with the car flipping and everything going on with the shattered ankle, and he needed facial reconstruction surgery. So he had plastic surgery on his face on April 25th, and he was released from the hospital the next day. He had 4 steel plates put in his face, and he has one more operation to go to remove the steel rod, and was put into his ankle in his first ankle operation. So Brian Pillman working his way back. We do know he will have, opportunity to work later on in 1997, but he does. 1996 has been all about him going into this year. He wanted to build some leverage for himself, and he did just that. But now he takes an unfortunate situation and just shows how talented the guy is. When he's unable to walk and literally they have to reconstruct his face, he still finds a way later in 1996 and also early 1997 to get paid a big amount of money from WWF. It's just amazing to see what he's able to do and convince people he can work. And we talked about it last week. Despite the injuries being career threatening, the doctors had signed off saying that he would be okay to wrestle and be able to continue his career in the same capacity. We do know that unfortunately his life has ended shortly, later on in 1997, but he did get the money he was looking for. And despite this, he overcame the odds as far as this car accident goes, and most people would not have been able to do what he did. So kudos to him. And we are looking forward to talking more about Pillman, hopefully in a better light as the years go on Shot of Nostalgia. So hopefully we touch base. Maybe we'll do WWF 1997, because that is a great era of wrestling to talk about. One of my favorite for sure. We also have just a quick note here in the newsletter. Supposedly Hogan said no more jobs. So we know Hogan is off filming Santa with Muscles. He's taking some much needed time off, not for his own, I guess, rest, but because the fans are sick of him and he's getting booed. He's supposed to be this cash cow, this money maker, and WCW is trying to get a return on the investment of Hulk Hogan, paid a lot of money to bring him over to Atlanta and WCW. And it seems like that Hulkamania well is running dry. Little did they know they're about to tap into the biggest money pit of all time, waiting to be grabbed with that Hogan heel turn only a few short months later, being that third man with the New World Order. It is absolutely remarkable, whether it was purposeful or they didn't even know at this time. My thoughts, especially listening to 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff, that he didn't know. Like, I don't think anyone knew at this point, because we'll see in the newsletter the plans that Hogan had, or they had for Hogan, I should say, later on in 1996 as we move on, because he was similar to a lot of guys that he thought the gimmick was the gimmick and he wanted to never change, because it is a risk to turn heel, and for it to flop would have been a huge risk for Hulk Hogan, because his brand, it's like turning Superman heel. He took a risk. And yes, it's easy to look back retrospectively and say it worked out. It was the best move he ever did. But there was an inherent risk that he was taking here. And, got to give him some credit there for stepping outside of the box. He was almost forced to, because of the fact, obviously, he was reading the tea leaves, seeing that Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were organically getting over and the wrestling business was moving in that direction. But he still had to make the choice to do it. And there was a lot of risk there. And we see a lot of guys that never turned heel. We talk about John Cena. Obviously, he was a heel coming in 2003 with the Thuganomics character, but main event run never turned heel. And what could have been, So the reason all the tapings during the 3-week period from mid-July through early August will be at Disney's because of the Olympics. All the Turner trucks will be covering the Olympics in Atlanta, and basically much of the TV operations are being shut down. WCW didn't want to shut down because it would kill momentum in a competitive wrestling war. So they had to go to Disney, since it had its own equipment, and do all its taping there. But they'll go back to arenas after the Olympics. So not the same situation, but very similar to AEW and WWE having to work during the pandemic era and figure out a way to do their live programming that they are contracted to do with the TV networks, with a lot of money on the line, without an audience. But obviously the Disney Center, they're going to have a smaller audience than they would with the arena shows. But it's just interesting that, thinking on their feet, they were able to find a standing operation similar to, Thunderdome, or I guess NWA back in the day used to do those Atlanta studio shows. They figured out a way to get it to work. And obviously the Olympics takes precedent. A lot of times, we used to see WWF get preempted for the Westminster Dog Show. So wrestling takes a backseat, especially at this era right now. It isn't quite the powerhouse it would become only a few short years later. So they had to make do with the Olympics dominating coverage. And this is, something that wrestling has to overcome. And it's interesting to think about, because you don't think about how it all shakes itself out with the way other things are working out, like the sporting events. Everything is, you want to look at ratings and you want to look at things going on in the world. Everything affects everything as far as circumstance goes. And the Olympics undoubtedly was affecting ratings, not only for WCW, but for WWF. And the fact that the Olympics were in Atlanta that year on U.S. soil, the headquarters of TNT, all their focus was off of WCW, whether that's a good or bad thing. They're putting all their eggs in that basket of the Olympics. So WCW took a backseat for a little bit over a month. So we have on our schedule, the next Clash of Champions will be 8/14 in Denver. So we will definitely be covering that as it pops up. If you want to look at the schedule that we have, again, on Instagram or also on the turnbuckletavern.com, we have our schedule for everything we're going to be working on. So like I said, we will be going all the way through November with this evergreen content to talk about everything going on in 1996. So it's pretty planned out, which is, without Mike Belcaster here, it sucks. I want him here to talk about the stuff, but we have a tight schedule to run to make sure we get to where we want to be, because we want to have some special guests on for certain landmark episodes, potentially next week with SLAMBOREE, potentially Bash at the Beach. We want to have people that experience this live, fans that have experienced this live, from not only the Pod Foundation, but from different wrestling podcasters all over. we are scouring the net to find some fans that experience this live because I want their perspective as well, because we can read the newsletters, we can talk about the results, but at the end of the day, if you are someone who experienced this live, it's from a different perspective. And I know I was listening to, I think it was the flagship, Freems was talking about the list he did was the most embarrassing moments or the cringiest moments in WCW history. And he was talking about watching WCW through rose-colored glasses as a kid. It's the same with everything. I mean, nostalgia is, and here's the name of the show, Shot Nostalgia. Nostalgia is something that it sells for sure, but it's almost better in your memory. Like if you go back and watch some of these shows, for me, a lot of this WCW on the weekly side is stuff I've seen for the first time ever. Like I know the storylines, I know the guys, I know everything that's going on, but since being a WWF kid, watching that programming, you can't watch both. So I'm curious for someone who watched this live, how it holds up. Do they remember it as fondly? Is it as good or worse? I'm curious about that because I can certainly watch WWF from the era, from this era, from a little bit later. And it's different. Sometimes you look back at more fondly when you remember it in your brain. But I digress. We're hoping to get more and more guests on here as the time goes on, because the format is I want it just to be loose and we can talk about the wrestling, because at the end of the day, we're all fans, and some people experience this live and in person. Some are experiencing this for the first time, like myself. I want everyone to hop on this train because it's a lot of fun. And it's giving me a reason to watch in long form. Like, I've mentioned this on the Discord. I mentioned this on other shows. In 1997, WWF is like one of my favorite eras. I went back and watched all of that during 2020 on Peacock or WWE Network. And I watched every single Raw, every single pay-per-view, and it was awesome. So that's where this idea was born. I was explaining it to Mike Belcaster, and we were talking about how much fun it was, but you need a reason to do it. My reason was because we were home and I needed something to watch. There was a lot of TV that had been consumed, but by that time, there's only so much TV you can watch, and wrestling stepped in and saved the day again. But when you have a reason to watch and people to talk about this with, it's like a book club to talk about 1996 WCW. So hop on board with the bandwagon. It's a lot of fun. And so this is one of the parts that Meltzer got wrong. So this is what he said about WCW expecting to go fairly quickly to Hogan versus Scott Hall and Giant versus Kevin Nash feuds before the inevitable Giant versus Hogan feud for the title. We do know we eventually get the Hogan versus Giant feud all the way in October, but little did we know Hogan would be joining forces, not going against the two outsiders. So very interesting. It makes me believe that even WCW officials did not know. People in creative probably didn't know that Hogan would be joining. And the famous story goes, I think Hogan called Bischoff when he was sitting poolside and said he needed to turn heel, and came up with the idea about being the third man. History says that Sting would have been the third man. Would it have the same impact? Undoubtedly, I would say no. Sting is a legend, but I think no one would have made the impact that Hogan did as turning heel. It's hard to quantify the meaning and how much it transcended not even just wrestling. It became pop culture. And that's why you still see these NWO shirts everywhere. It resonated with fans. For good or for better or for worse, people wanted to cheer the bad guy. And it was such a refreshing change for Hulk Hogan. So that's our May 6th newsletter. We're going to move to May 13th newsletter. And there's some more things to talk about here. Not too much, but again, want to cover the whole landscape to give you guys the full broad stroke of everything going on in the world of wrestling, mostly WCW. So unfortunately, Ray Stevens passed away in his sleep the morning of May 3rd at the age of 60. So just noting here, we're going to see some tributes on Nitro. If you watch Nitro from this week, there is a tribute to Ray Stevens. Ray Stevens is a legend. Go back and watch some of his old stuff from a different generation of wrestling. Obviously born 1935. One of the more famous wrestlers in the world, influenced a lot of guys that we all love. But it was very interesting to hear some of the stories, and there was letters and stuff in the newsletter. I'm not going to talk about all of those, but Ray Stevens had a huge influence on the wrestling business and gone too soon, just like many in the wrestling world, unfortunately. So moving on in the newsletter, there were reports on May 7th, just breaking that the FTC was looking to holding up the Turner-Time Warner merger because of the effect it could have on cable television domination. The belief was that it would still go through, but it might be delayed. Although some in pro wrestling who believe Vince McMahon is more important than God may credit his work with it. Nobody even gave the idea that pro wrestling had anything to do with any of the credence credibility. So a lot of wording there by Dave Meltzer, essentially saying that Vince McMahon has a lot of pull here in the television business, that potentially having Turner, Time Warner monopolizing TV would be a bad thing for entertainment network and all of that. So even back here, Vince McMahon is not nearly the words powerhouse, I guess, bulletproof. He still had a lot of sway here in 1996, but very, very interesting that even here, the networks play a huge part in not only the future, but the present that we're dealing with as well. So a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same conversations we were having in 1996, we're still continuing to have in 2022. The end of the day, it's about money and making money for these companies. And who does it better than Vince McMahon? Moving on here, we have Demolenko capturing the WCW Cruiserweight Championship from Ohtani at the Disney Tapings on May 2nd. The match will air on Worldwide on May 18th. So when we talk about the Nitros from this week, he shows up on Nitro. He definitely won the Cruiserweight Championship, but they don't air it until the 18th, so he doesn't have the title with him. Very confusing stuff. This was similar to when Conan won the the U.S. title. This was and even also with Johnny B. Bad with the TV title. When you tape events in bulk, this can be messy. So we've seen in the past that they reveal the wrong things. They may show up with the wrong title. When you record in bulk, and especially since now their home base is in Disney and they're trying to film as much as possible, sometimes the storylines fall in disalignment. And this is one of those things where they have to wait to show Demolenko on TV with the belt and make sure it airs at the right time. And if you have the right person pulling the strings and making sure everything's in order, it's no problem. But you want to make sure it's all in alignment to your storytelling, because when you have titles change hands on shows that are taped, this can be messy. So as we talked about, Ohtani was announced as the new champion on Nitro this current week, and they talked about his first title defense on May 18th. So Malenko will go into the pay-per-view match against Brad Armstrong as champion. In later matches taped at Disney, Malenko neither came out with the belt, nor was announced as champion, nor did anyone come out with the belt. Based on the last taping, there is no such thing as planning more than a few weeks out, so it may not mean anything, but it could mean Armstrong will beat Malenko for the title. Lex Luger, who is TV champ, and Luger and Sting tag champs also worked without their belts without being announced as champions, but Giant made several title defenses at the taping, including a near squash over Kensuke Sasaki. So, interesting enough, we just talked about taping in bulk and champions sort of muddy the water a little bit there. I mean, it could just be they don't want the titles on them at the moment to not mess up. And like if they decide to change their plans, they, guys not holding the title anyway, and they come out without titles, but it's not authentic. And we talked about the Rampage ratings being awful and all that because it's being taped. It feels like it's canned and not organic and just very blah. The words blah. This adds to it as well. When you have your champions not coming out with your championship belt, it's weak. But my guess would be, and I'm sure Eric Bischoff would probably attest to this, that since you're filming in bulk, you want to make sure that you have consistent storytelling without having to go back and change things. Because if you decide you want Luger and Sting to lose the title somewhere else and they came out and that show is airing 2 weeks from now, or say Sting gets hurt or Luger gets hurt, it ruins the whole show. You throw it out. So I don't blame them for doing that, but sometimes you can't film in bulk. This is live television business, and it thrives on live content. So taping in bulk, it's been done throughout the history of wrestling, but to me, it gets messy. So you almost you have to unwind and figure out different ways to make things better when you mess it up. You might as well just do it live and in person. So best laid plans sometimes don't always go. So Demolenko currently, as we go into here, and we'll talk about the champions as we go in the beginning of Nitro, currently won the title, but it will not be announced until the 18th, which means he will defend the title on pay-per-view. So he wins it the night before that SLAMBOREE airs, but we'll continue to talk about that as it comes up. Kevin Green signed a 2-year deal with the Carolina Panthers, and he'll still be doing the June 16th match with WCW. Moving on, both WCW and WWF prominently mentioned the death of Ray Stevens on their Monday night shows. Bischoff talked about it in somber tones. WWF opened the show with clips of him and dedicated the TV show to his memory. In some ways, this business has improved a lot when it comes to class over the past few years, not to mention competition forcing the production and booking of television shows to markedly improve. In the past, deaths of stars every bit as prominent, such as Dick the Bruiser, Bruiser Brody, Kerry Von Erich, and even Buddy Rogers, were ignored by both promotions on television. WWF didn't acknowledge Von Erich or Dino Bravo on TV, even though they had recently been headliners with that group. WCW didn't acknowledge the death of Eddie Gilbert, even though he was on their television a lot and helped book. WWF did acknowledge the death of John Studd and Andre the Giant in recent years. So we see it's like a common occurrence now, unfortunately, when people do pass away. But WWF or WWE, even AEW, they do a nice job of honoring those of the past, and I've done so retroactively as well for some guys, like putting them in post-mortemly into the Hall of Fame. They've done a better job. But at this time, dedicating a show or doing it in a way that was classy was apparently not something they were doing frequently. So very curious to go back and maybe watch some other shows. I mean, I know they did show a scroll for Pillman in 97, but to not include Dick the Bruiser, Bruiser Brody, Kerry Von Erich, Dino Bravo, all those guys we talked, Buddy Rogers, I mean, unacceptable. So it's interesting to see how the business has changed. And of course, we see it now. The great tributes we had to Eddie Guerrero when he passed, even Brody Lee. That show was one of the better AEW shows of all time. They did such a great job. And CM Punk credits that he knew that was the time he wanted to come back and wrestle. So honoring your past and paying tribute to those who paved the way is important. So I'm glad that WCW and WWE at this point honored Ray Stevens, but in the past, some of those guys were ignored, which is a shame. So the Blood Runs Cold promos that we know to be Glacier, Meltzer believes it's Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, or both. So he's dead wrong here. So I'll admit it live here on air. Dave Meltzer is wrong sometimes. So he was swerved by this Blood Runs Cold stuff. Besides Liger, Sasaki, and Ohtani, also at Disney was Masachono. So we see some New Japan talent here on Nitro, similar to Forbidden Door. We're seeing guys cross over and just work live on air. So Finley had left to work for Otto Wands in Austria and is expected back in a few months. David Taylor will take his place on the pay-per-view as Steve Regal's partner. Finley has been the highlight of a couple of Nitros we talked about. We had that parking lot brawl. We had that match at Super Brawl where he got his nose broken, or he broke Regal's nose. So we're going to miss Finley for a bit. We won't see him, which is the shame. And David Taylor's not the best replacement for him, but he'll be serviceable. But I can't wait to see Finley come back later in 1996. So for SLAMBOREE, you have 16 matches announced for the pay-per-view. They would be better off putting 4 of the tag 20 matches on the main event show, so the pay-per-view matches won't be so rushed, even though it is still a 12-match pay-per-view. Plus, they've got nobody worth the crap who isn't on pay-per-view already booked in TV squashes. So because of the lethal lottery stuff, it is chaotic. And we'll talk about SLAMBOREE next week. I don't want to talk too much about it. This will be the go-home show towards it. We certainly will talk a lot about it, but the card is messy. Good in theory. And a nice supplementary thing to talk about here is listen to Eric Bischoff's take on the concept of the lethal lottery and what it means. And essentially, if you guys don't know, and of course, we will talk about it in depth next week when we discuss SLAMBOREE. They put guys into a drawing, random. They don't show on TV, which would have been beneficial to the storytelling. And they have tag partners wrestle each other. So we're seeing Hawk and Animal wrestle each other. The Steiners wrestle each other. So cool in theory, but for a full pay-per-view, it gets really messy. And at the end, we have a battle royal. It's a whole thing. And again, Mike Belcaster and myself will go through it line by line. And that might be a longer episode because, again, we have like 16 matches to cover. So continuing here, Conan wasn't at any of the tapings because he was working on his suspension problem in Mexico. Rumors were flying that Conan would lose the title to Liger, who then would lose it to Guerrero. Eddie Guerrero worked 2 TV matches against Benoit, won a double countout, and Guerrero taking the other. Liger beat Ohtani in another TV match that was said to be a hot crowd and a great match. So Conan, one of the hottest stars People talked about him being on the level in Mexico as Hulk Hogan. And I think it was Eric Bischoff or Dave Meltzer telling the story of Conan and how big he actually was. And it was probably Meltzer. And I think I was listening to Wrestling Observer Radio, and the story was awesome, where he didn't understand like the impact that Conan had on Mexican wrestling until he was there for AAA, Triple Mania, when Conan was in his run, and they were at a restaurant eating before an event, maybe before Triple Mania or whatever. And just having Conan appear on a soap opera, the whole restaurant stopped. Waiters, everyone stopped moving, was silent watching Conan on the screen in the soap opera he appeared in. And that's when Meltzer was like, wow, the impact can't be understated. And I think the Chads are talking about it on the flagship about how these Japanese stars for Forbidden Door, it's hard to present them with the reverence and importance that they actually have on their company. A guy like Okada, a guy like Tanahashi, it's hard to quantify 20 years of the impact they have in New Japan and what they mean to Japanese wrestling culture and what they mean to the style of wrestling that they're presenting. But their impact can't be understated, because even though we didn't see it here in the States and we have such a narrow view and a scope that we only can see from our perspective, their impact is immense. And as I'm learning here through 1996 and discussing everything that's going on here, Conan was every bit as influential as any other person that worked that style of wrestling. He brought a lot to WCW and to North America, and everyone owes a debt of gratitude to Conan for the wrestling we see today. He is, I mean, I can't think of another guy who can be as influential in the Mexican lucha libre style for the popular culture here in North America, and most specifically the United States. Conan is immensely important to what became wrestling, Mexican wrestling, as part of just the everyday show, where guys like Rey Mysterio got their shot, eventually becoming world champions. So for me, it was very eye-opening to see Conan in this light, because he's been very impressive just in what I've seen of him as being United States champion. But I remember him as the Filthy Animals guy, the booker for Lucha Underground, seeing him here and there in Impact, seeing him appear in Legends roles. But him in his prime, man, what a superstar. Looked like $1 million. Man, he's one of the guys that really shine here in 1996. Guys I didn't think would shine. Then in the beginning, I was like, oh, all right, Conan's getting a run. He's the Mexican heavyweight champion, but he's every bit as advertised. And I don't know if he gets the credit he deserves for all the impact he's had. So Conan is awesome. So we'll obviously talk more and more about him as we go on, because he's hanging around for 1996, and hopefully he's back soon from the suspension stuff in Mexico. Finishing up the newsletter here, Eric Bischoff said in an interview with Mike Mooneyham for the Wrestling Observer Hotline and the Charleston Post Courier that it was an outright lie regarding Johnny B. Bad's claim that after his contract expired, that he was only making $150 per match. So we've seen the dispute, the now famous story that we all have on Shot Nostalgia, where he had a conversation in the airport with Johnny B. Bad, and Johnny said he wanted more money. He wants to be a star. Eric kind of scoffed at him and said, we're trying to make you a star. Go and do your thing in WWF. Prove us wrong. We know that Bischoff ultimately was right, that Mero was Mero. He was onto something with this Johnny B. Bad character, and maybe in a different era, it would have resonated better with fans. But this is the quote from Bischoff. We have never, ever paid Johnny $150. He knows it, and if he gets to it, I can supply copies of checks to prove it. His contract was up. He was given a new contract, and he was being paid the same rate under his old contract. There was no change in his compensation. He's an emotional guy, and he may have meant something else when he said it. So Meltzer has some heated words as well about Johnny B. Bad, and these are his words, not mine. But Meltzer talking about Johnny B. Bad, formerly known as Mark Mero from WWF. The problem with Johnny is that he's lazy and he's spoiled, and he didn't want to leave home. And he didn't want to do things the rest of the talent like Sting, Luger, Hogan, and Savage had to do. And that's promote the business. Now, Johnny spent a lot of time talking in schools and churches and youth groups, and that's cool. I've even gone to 1 or 2 of those with Johnny. I'm very supportive of that, but the reality is that's something Johnny wanted to do, and it made him feel good about himself. That didn't necessarily translate to major public relations opportunities for WCW. They didn't hurt us, and in intangible ways, it helped us. I apologize. That is Meltzer, but Bischoff was later critical of Mark Marrow's leaving in regard to him talking about how important his family and daughter are. Now, he claimed his daughter's reaction made them drop the Kimberly angle, bringing up the WWF did an angle with his wife where he started out with Hunter Hearst Helmsley. They would be on the road away from his daughter, then that much more in WWF, and that his wife was traveling on the road with them. A lot to talk about there. I know we've been talking about Johnny B. Bad, and who would have thought we'd be talking about Mark Marrow this much here on the podcast or on the show? But, it's interesting to see how transparent Eric Bischoff is here with the media. Today, it feels like they would probably just sweep it under the rug, especially with real life stuff. And we talked about work, shoot, blah, blah, blah with the MJF issues. But at the same time, having all this out in the open, it's kind of uncharted territory. And he's putting Johnny Bad on full blast, calling his bluff. And it's very interesting to see Eric Bischoff sort of having a different approach than others in the past have. And we saw Eric Bischoff definitely marches to the beat of his own drum in a lot of ways. And this is one of them, that he just goes straight for the jugular with some of these guys that he feels aren't telling the truth. And he uses his media outlet, his sway and his voice to, I guess, get the voice heard, because I think he believes this issue is really important to get in front of, because of the fact that if guys feel like Eric Bischoff's not paying and not living up to what he said he would pay and all that, other guys would be hesitant to come. So I think he feels like he has to make it right and make an example of Johnny B. Bad. We'll see if he continues to have an appearance here in the newsletter. We know that he'll be over in WWF later on with the Mark Marrow Wildman gimmick, and eventually as the valet for Sable in 1998. But yeah, so that's Johnny B. Bad here in the newsletter. And that's all we have here for that. And I think it's time to get our fix. We definitely wet our whistle a little bit here. A lot of stuff to unpack in the newsletter. I would certainly need to wet my whistle, and I'm sure maybe we'll have some DQ finishes to take our shots of nostalgia. But it's time to get our fix. It is time to get our fix. And of course, as we mentioned, we'll be talking about 2 Nitros this week. The first being live from Daytona Beach, Florida, Ocean Center, May 6th, 1996. We'll be talking about Monday Nitro. I'm going to put the scroll on the bottom so you guys can follow along here. Our current champions, as we discussed earlier, our WCW World Heavyweight Champion is the Giant. He won it back on April 29th, 1996. We have our U.S. Champion, Conan, my favorite wrestler right now. Conan, January 29th, he won the U.S. title. Our tag champions are still Sting and Luger. They won on January 22nd. Our world television champion is Lex Luger, who won it back on March 6th. And our cruiserweight champion, currently in dispute, is Demolenko. It's yet to air, but currently he won it. But Ohtani's still holding the title here on Nitro. I don't think we see Ohtani in this episode, but as we talked about, it gets muddy a little bit when we have guys winning titles or losing titles on tapings and then having to not show the belts, and very confusing. So if you're going to tape something, air it like the next week. So this way you don't have to wait to show titles and have live shows or live events with the guy with the title and then he loses it. Very confusing. As always, we have our hosts, Steve McMichael, Bobby Heenan, and Eric Bischoff to open the show for us. The Emmy Award winning Steve Mongo McMichael. And these guys are a lot of fun to listen to. I really enjoy the 3 of them together. And it's sort of an acquired taste, because if you're a WWF fan growing up, Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler give you a whole different experience through the Attitude Era. Even when they're doing the stuff, even with Vince being the announcer, it's a completely different approach you have to get used to. But I am a huge fan of the broadcast team. Even on pay-per-views, we got Tony Schiavone. We got Dusty Rhodes. Like, it's a nice aesthetic, and it feels like WCW. And Bischoff on commentary is great. So we open our show with Hugh Morris defeating Randy Savage by DQ. We're going to talk about the match, and I will be taking my first shot of nostalgia. One of, I'm not sure how many. We got the shoot bottle right here. So shots already poured for this match. And man, no warming up in the bullpen here, guys. We're going right into it. So they are still treating Randy Savage like he's going crazy over this whole stuff, being screwed of the title. Miss Elizabeth turning on him. Morris attacks Savage before he's even getting in the ring. This match only goes 3 minutes and 8 seconds. Savage lets Morris go, brings him to the ring for a macho elbow drop against the ref's plea. When the ref gets in Randy's face for his disobedience, he slaps the ref. Randy Anderson runs in to stop the mayhem, but Savage is snapped and gives the original ref the macho elbow. So the DQ came where Hugh Morris grabs the jacket, wraps it around Hugh's throat. This is Savage wrapping around his throat, hangs him with the top rope until the ref calls for the DQ because Savage is around, going crazy and all that. So short match, trying to get over the fact that Randy is still disgruntled, off the handle. Reminds me a lot of the Ken Shamrock Unhinged stuff where he's beating up referees. At this point, Randy Savage is a face, I would say, obviously, because he has all the bad guys coming against him, but some heel tendencies here. And this is the first time I think some of the good guys are doing heel stuff and they're getting cheered for it. So maybe a little, dipping your feet into the water of what really worked for the NWO, where they were tweeners, and eventually what worked for Stone Cold Steve Austin, where he was the biggest babyface in wrestling at the time, maybe ever. And he was just beating the crap out of his boss and beating the crap out of referees. So Randy Savage, a little bit ahead of his time. So, opening match, you get to see Randy Savage come out. It looks like $1 million. On the ledger, as you guys see it popping across here, Hugh Morris gets the win. So probably the biggest win in Hugh Morris's career over Randy Savage, DQ or not. So with that, we're going to take our first shot of nostalgia. Not sure how many shots of nostalgia we're going to be taking. I think we're also, just to confirm, we're going to still be doing shots of nostalgia for countouts, no contests, matches that, are advertised but don't happen. So I think that's important to disclose. So Bellcaster, that's what we'll be doing. So DQ finish. All right. Woo. All right. So Bischoff announced the passing of one of the greatest influences of the modern era of wrestling, Ray Stevens, as I mentioned in the newsletter. They put up a graphic to where you can donate money instead of sending flowers to Ray's favorite charity, the Cauliflower Alley Club. So the first time I've seen Cauliflower Alley on TV. You hear about it all the time, as it used to be a gathering type of gala for wrestling alum. It held a lot of weight as far as decision making goes in the wrestling world, and be able to, similar to, I guess, I would say the events were similar to like a StarCast, but only wrestlers were invited. So it was like an exclusive opportunity to go there. And if you were family or friends of the wrestling community, you can go, but it wasn't as open to fans. And I think eventually it was open to fans over time. So that was very interesting to see on TV. First time I saw the logo, all that stuff. So our next match here, we have Demolenko defeating Jushin Liger with Sonny Ono. So Bischoff does mention that Ohtani is the new WCW Cruiserweight Champion and will be facing Demolenko in a few weeks. They didn't say which date. We know the title change does air on May 18th episode of Worldwide. This match was awesome. Demolenko is really underrated as far as in-ring work goes. One of the better guys that's ever done it. Even think back to his time in 2001 when he came over with or 2000 when he came over with the Radicals. He was a forgotten thought. I mean, you always talk about Chris Benoit, you talk about Eddie Guerrero, people even talk about Perry Saturn over him. But Demolenko might be one of the most sound wrestlers in all of history. I go back to even him and Lance Storm, two guys that if they had a little bit more charisma, think about the stars they could have been. But as far as in-ring work goes, man, Demolenko is bar none one of the best guys to work. And there's no other good reason for, him not to be on people's top list of work rate guys. But he continues to help build matches throughout wrestling right now, working for AEW. And I'm pretty sure he's still an agent. So this is for good reason. The guy has good ring psychology because it's not just about being able to do crazy moves and crazy spots. Everything makes sense. And Demolenko in this match, and Jushin Liger, legend too, like absolute legend. Just crazy good match. Go back and watch this. It went 6 minutes and 51 seconds. So some of the good spots. That wrist locks exchange in the beginning. Liger avoids a monkey flip and levels Malenko with an enziguri to take him to the floor. So the distracting part about this match was the fact that Ric Flair was shooting an angle during this because Ric Flair had ladies at a table with alcohol and money and stuff while the match is going on. They break away for like 30 seconds at a clip to talk about what Flair's doing, and it takes away from the match. I personally hate that stuff when there's good in-ring quality stuff going on and you're focused on something different. I understand you got to fit it in and it's got to make sense for Nitro, and people, Flair's a star. People come to see, you turn on the TV to see Flair, but the wrestling match between the two of these deserved more of a spotlight. And the ending saw Liger countering a powerbomb into a pinning situation. Liger flips out of a suplex and gets nailed with the Tiger Driver for the 3. Man, the Cruiserweight division is definitely one of the highlights of WCW, and you see good reason about what's building here. And we talk about it all the time with the 6-man division that's been building in AEW for a very long time. You could see the justification of the Cruiserweight division and how meaningful it really is for not only the smaller wrestlers, but for the lucha culture here in WCW, and how you have an eclectic mix of styles. I think the stuff that you see with Demolenko here, to me, is just very impressive. And I can't wait to see for what the rest of the year holds with the other Cruiserweight matches, because they're giving it a lot of spotlight, and that's what separates it from WWF. These types of matches were not happening on their programming, and eventually we do see it. Vince eventually caves and has the smaller guys wrestle on programming, but it took a while, especially, I think 1998 is when the light heavyweight championship was won by Taka Michinoku, but their lightweight heavyweight division didn't have the same feel, obviously. And then we saw years later, when they purchased WCW, they brought over the Cruiserweight concept, but it's hard to capture lightning in the bottle like WCW did here, and this was a good example of it. So great match. Go back and check this out if you did not watch it. We go over to Gene Okerlund with Ric Flair and the ladies. Robin Leach couldn't get invited to Ric Flair party. That's what Gene Okerlund said. At SLAMBOREE, when he teams up with Randy Savage to take on Arn Anderson and Eddie Guerrero in their lethal lottery match, he's going to eliminate Savage again. Tells Double A that he better not make the wrong decision again across Flair. No mention of Eddie. Flair gives Mongo's wife, Deborah, in the front row a glass of champagne. She takes it and dumps champagne on the floor. Decent segment trying to build up the concept of Ric Flair and Arn Anderson working on opposite sides of the ring. Again, the concept of the lethal lottery thing makes some sense. It has some legs to it, but in execution, it lacks for sure. I mean, it feels very muddied. And when I watched SLAMBOREE, and it became quite apparent that they had this idea, but they didn't really flesh it out because it's long. It's a long event. And I know most of their pay-per-views are long, and we give them a lot of grief sometimes about how short the match is here on Nitro, because it feels like it's a advertisement for their longer matches. But a 16 match card with nothing really on the line, just kind of like bragging rights, and just the appeal of having partners wrestle each other loses its luster quickly into the night. But again, not to talk too much about that event, because when Bellcaster's back next week, we will discuss it in depth. We have a Blood Runs Cold promo on air. We know eventually is Glacier. And as Dave Meltzer said in the newsletter, he thinks it's Scott Hall, but it is Glacier. So, and I still think that if Glacier maybe came a year prior, he would be like the biggest thing in wrestling. It just happens that he debuts. They push the debut all the way like to September, I think, in the fall, but we don't see it. But they run these eternal things like they were doing with what's the dude's name on Raw? Whatever his name is. But this one was the first one where Glacier, it feels like, when is he coming? And they do it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and eventually months. I think he debuts in September, because I looked it up. I wanted to have him on the show, and I messaged him. So stay tuned. We may get Glacier on here to discuss because I know that Mike Belcast was a huge Glacier fan. So we want to make sure we are appealing to that section of the audience. But yeah, so Glacier's coming. Very influenced by Mortal Kombat Sub-Zero. So yeah, stay tuned for Glacier. Our next match here, we have Sting defeating Lord Steven Regal with Jeeves. We have Heenan doing Heenan stuff on commentary. It was pretty much a big highlight of this match. Match runs 6 minutes and 22 seconds. This was a really good match. I mean, two legends in the ring. If you look at it, William Regal versus Sting, some sound wrestling. It's amazing that Sting's still doing it today. And Regal is in AEW as well, not wrestling, but they're both there. They're both having their minds picked as far as the young talent goes. They're a great resource, and they were doing it great all the way back in 1996. Even with this bad gimmick that Regal has, he's still awesome. Man, good match. So we have the ending C. Sting comes back with a drop kick and a pair of Japanese arm drags. Stinger splash misses, but Sting backdrops out of a butterfly suplex into a very painful looking bridge for the 3. Nice little win for Sting here with an interesting pin. Great match. Very solid match. Again, 6 minutes and 22 seconds doesn't feel like a long time, but they really fit a lot into it. Very, very awesome. Everything you could want from a Sting and Regal match. You give another 5-6 minutes, it could go. You could headline a pay-per-view with these two guys because that's how good they both are. All right, so we had the WCW World Heavyweight Champion, the Giant, supposed to be taking on Lex Luger. Luger no-showed a world title shot on the previous Saturday night where Marcus Bagwell replaced him, and Luger does the same here. Jim Duggan comes out as a replacement. Man, if I was watching this live, I would have been pissed because you're expecting to have the Giant and Luger. It doesn't happen, and you wind up getting Jim Duggan. And even back then, even as a kid, I don't think I would know or think. I don't think I would think that you would have Jim Duggan win the title, especially against the Giant, especially how unbeatable he is. You couldn't find anyone better. Jim Duggan? Really? So with that being said, Jim Duggan does come out and he gets his ass whooped. 3 minutes and 16 seconds. Giant has no issue taking the boots to Jim Duggan. He squashes Duggan to and from. The only time that Jim Duggan got any offense in was when Giant went for the avalanche in the corner, with his back facing in, and he missed it. Sold the butt for a second, and then Duggan goes for the tape. Doesn't matter. Chokeslam. That's the match. Pins him. We get another chokeslam for Duggan, and then continues to beat him up in the ring. And then we get Cobra, Cuban Assassin, Alex Wright coming out. They all receive chokeslams. Ric Flair comes from behind with a wooden chair, bashes in the Giant's head. Giant no-sells it. And then Sting comes in for the save. So Giant chokeslams Flair. Sting comes down to the ring with a chop block. He unloads on Giant. Nails Jimmy Hart and takes Giant off his feet with a flying double sledge. Scorpion Deathlock. Sting turns him over. The crowd is going nuts for this. Jimmy then whacks Sting with the megaphone with no effect. Here comes Luger with the briefcase. For a second there, I thought maybe he would have swerved us and hit Sting. We didn't get it. Gene Okerlund comes into the ring to make sense of this. Sting asks Luger where he's been. Nothing is settled. And we have no idea what kept Luger from not showing up. And we're out of time. That's the end of Nitro, the first one that we're talking about here tonight. Crazy ending. A lot going on. The bait and switch here. And I know we just talked about it before. I do have another shot of nostalgia because they advertised the match. Didn't happen. Technically, Luger versus the Giant didn't happen. So I have to take a shot for that. A shot of nostalgia for that. All right. So where they're building with Luger, I'm not sure. They've been teasing this for the longest time that he's a face, he's a heel, he's getting along with Sting. He's not. They still have the tag titles. In my opinion, they're holding them hostage. There's such a good array of tag teams here in WCW, and we are having a team that's just put together. I don't know. Man, this was a very, very good episode of Nitro, but they aired at a different time. So just keep in mind with the ratings, if you're going back and looking at the ratings, and I don't put too much stock in them as far as what they mean and stuff. I mean, obviously people wax poetic about the Monday Night Wars and look at the ratings and how they went up and down, how close they were. But you have to consider the time slots. And I know people don't want to talk about time slots, but they play a huge part, because if you air it at not the usual time, and especially back in 1996, it's appointment viewing. So people tune in at their normal time. It's not on. They don't come back. So Nitro aired at 7 p.m. instead of its usual 9, where it was directly going against Raw because of TNT airing the NBA playoffs. So WWF gets the win here by a huge margin, and that's not going to be for long, because this, in 2 more weeks, we're going to be getting our next episode, we'll talk about it. Scott Hall shows up, and that changes the landscape of everything. So WWF can enjoy their victory for now, but WCW is hot on their tails. So moving over to the next Nitro here, we got our May 13th, 1996 Nitro. See the Municipal Auditorium. As we talked about, our champions are all the same. The Giant is the world champ. Conan's our U.S. champ. Sting and Lex Luger are tag champs. Our TV champ is Lex Luger. And our Cruiserweight champion is technically Ohtani, because he doesn't have it on TV yet, but Demolenko is the proud owner of it. It's sitting in Demolenko's car. It's still in his car. So our host, Eric Bischoff, Bobby Heenan, and Steve Mongo McMichael introduce us to the show. They open the show with Luger camped out at the Nashville Municipal Auditorium, so he wouldn't miss the show. So interesting look into it. To make right with Sting, he didn't want to miss the show, so he's camping out. Now that's commitment. So Luger trying to be a good tag partner. We open with Rick and Scott Steiner defeating Public Enemy. Public Enemy bumping like champs for the Steiners. Public Enemy was brought in as the headliners. I think maybe they're losing a little bit of favor from WCW booking, because they're being used as enhancement talent, sort of, to get the Steiners over. This match went 6 minutes and 55 seconds. The ending saw, great hot tag spot to Rick Steiner. Steiner lines all around. Public Enemy double teams Rick to cool him off, and then Grunz holds Rick for the somersault plancha from Rocco Rock. But then Grunz gets wiped out. Rick rolls Rocco into the ring for the Frankensteiner, and that's all she wrote. So a really good match, very fun opener, clean ending, made a lot of sense. Interesting, because in a vacuum, watching Public Enemy here, you don't get why they're so over. But if you go back and watch their ECW run, I think you'll get it. The teeth were a little bit removed from them when they went to WCW, because they couldn't be who they were. But they are still a really nice tag team. And this is sort of my beef I have with Luger and Sting being tag champs. The tag title should be involved with the Steiners, or with Harlem Heat, or with Public Enemy, even the Nasty Boys, because they are guys that are legitimate tag teams. And you can have a guy like Luger and a guy like Sting in the main event at all times. I know that they are combining some divisions and stuff, like Luger's the TV champion, and I'm sure Sting's involved in the world title picture. We saw him put the Scorpion Deathlock on the Giant at the end of Nitro last week. But I don't know, Sting and Luger could be doing something different, and you can really highlight your tag division. And I think that's a good thing about the AEW roster here that we're seeing in 2022 is, aside from the Hangman and Kenny Omega reign, we have authentic tag teams holding the belts. The Bucks, Jurassic Express, FTR, SCU, all guys that are even guys in competition, the Lucha Brothers, they're all legitimate tag teams. There's no throw together tag teams like our Triple H and Stone Colds, or, Big Show and whoever, Kane and whoever. It's just and to me, that's important to develop your tag division in that way. We move on to Chris Benoit defeating Squire David Taylor. So Dave Taylor is replacing Bobby Eaton around this point for the Blue Bloods. So Regal and Taylor for the rest of the team's existence, and Bobby goes back to being just Bobby. Benoit catches Taylor with an enziguri, but then Taylor dishes out some European uppercuts. This match was very competitive both ways. David Taylor kept up with Chris Benoit. Benoit is an absolute monster at this point. You forget how good he is, because I think a lot of people have blacked out a lot of what he's done for obvious reasons and for justified reasons. But just how ahead of his time as far as the work rate goes that Benoit was was delivering here on a weekly basis on Nitro. It's amazing. So the ending saw Taylor continuing the violence by smashing Benoit's head onto the guardrail and posting him real good. Back in, Benoit avoids a corner charge but gets caught with an electric chair drop. Fall away slam into a floater. As soon as Bischoff mentioned that Savage is near the building, Mongo leaves the announce table to go talk to him. Meanwhile, Taylor moves a crossbody out of the corner and gets drilled with a dragon suplex by Benoit for the 3. Match only went 4 minutes and 18 seconds. Really good match. They fit a lot into it. A little bit of distraction with the Savage stuff, but didn't take too much away from this. Midway through the match, they did mention that Belfast Bruiser went back to Ireland after the parking lot brawl and won't be at SLAMBOREE. Talked about it in the newsletter that Finlay is going to be off TV for a bit. So we won't have him on here. So stinks because he was delivering great matches. But nevertheless, we will see him back in 1996. But great match here. We have a segment following the match right after. Gene Okerlund standing outside, apparently the only door where you can get into the municipal auditorium. Security's there to keep Savage out of the building because he's been banned. He can't get past security, so he throws the bag down in frustration. Mongo comes out the door and wants to talk to Savage. He says he could sympathize with Savage and wants to devise some sort of plan. So it appears that Ric Flair somehow is convincing people that he shouldn't be Savage shouldn't be in the building. Mongo trying to figure out a way to work with Savage. So whatever. Interesting segment again. It's weird for me, especially like the Wardlow stuff. Like we see Wardlow just destroy security guards. Savage just backs down. He's able to destroy the whole wrestling roster, but a couple of security guards holds him out of the show. So, Gene's disgusted with this, by the way. Gene was great. Gene Okerlund has been great in these backstage segments. He does note that he doesn't think Savage has sought any behavioral or therapeutic help yet. So that was an interesting take by Gene Okerlund, which was funny. We get another Blood Runs Cold promo, and we know the Glacier is on his way. So despite what Meltzer says, it's not Hall, it's not Nash, it's Glacier. We get these promos for a very long time. We don't see him till the fall, but these promos are really good. Makes it feel like a really big deal. Very well done for 1996. Our next match is we have Ric Flair with Elizabeth and Woman defeating VK Wall Street. VK Wall Street's a low card heel, if you don't know who he is. But Ric Flair is a heel as well, and he's a main event heel. So I think this was a tough choice as far as booking goes, because if you want Rick to maintain his heat, why would you put him against another heel, especially a heel that's not as over and as popular as Ric Flair? So Ric Flair is getting cheered here. I'm not sure if that's the intention, because you want Rick to maintain his heat as a heel. But, you know, people are obviously going to cheer Ric Flair over Wall Street. This match goes only 6 minutes and 23 seconds. Flair gets the win, obviously. You know, VK Wall Street was not that memorable. And if you don't remember him, it's justified because he's not that memorable. This was the match was just there. It was confusing the booking wise because heel versus heel very rarely works unless it's done in the right way. And I don't think VK Wall Street's a strong enough character to elicit enough heat to keep Ric Flair being booed. So it's just very interesting. I mean, I'm sure Ric Flair, as soon as he gets on the mic, is able to get his heat back. But like, why not just put him against a low-grade face and have him get the win? Same thing would have happened. I know you're just trying to fit VK or Wall Street or whatever you want to call him on the show, but I don't know. Booking was weird, but I'll stand by that. Flair and his ladies sit down at the VIP table. Gene Okerlund gets a word with him. Flair responds to Savage's comments about dragging a dead man to the ring by kissing Oliver Liz. Gene mentions Deborah, which gets a rise from Flair. He considers himself Joe Namath. While Mongo was rolling the dirt, he was throwing touchdowns and staying up all night long. So Flair gets booed here a little bit, but like I said, it's weird to book him against a heel because it leaves people wanting to cheer the guy they're familiar with and the guy that has the longevity and the legendary status. I don't know, weird, but Flair is a legend. He figures out a way to get the heat back, and there it was. All right, we are back to our main event. WCW World Heavyweight Champion, The Giant versus Lex Luger. As advertised last week, we get a no contest. So that means We do have in our main event, our final match of the night, we do have a double count out, which means that there's no winner, which means I will take my final shot at nostalgia. But let me go through the match. So, interestingly enough, there is no entrances for either guy. Both are already in the ring, which probably tells us that when this was airing, we were a little bit short on time as far as the way it was airing from their normal time slot. Giant was no selling everything that Luger was doing. Just tossing Luger around. Luger gets caught running off the middle turnbuckle and driven back twice into the corner. They start running the ropes fairly fast to lead to Luger's bionic forearm. Bischoff did say, which was interesting, that Luger knocked out Yokozuna for 10 minutes with that forearm not that long ago. If you're counting, it was 3 years ago to that point. But interesting that they were mentioning WWF history. Like, he spent so much time ripping on WWF and what's going on there. That first time I think we're hearing that he's using it as like a qualification, something that makes Luger a little bit more legitimate. I don't know if they've ever mentioned that he has the bionic plate in his elbow. I mean, in his forearm anymore. But nice little mention there by Bischoff. I'm always taking notes on things like that because I thought it was very, very interesting because WWF gets shit on all over by Eric Bischoff. They used it to help them here. Luger tries knocking Giant off the apron and finally does after another bionic forearm. He still no sells as he drags Luger out and then choke slams him. He takes Luger over to Flair's VIP table, clears off the appetizers, and choke slams Luger through the table. Match went 4 minutes and 5 seconds because the ref counted them both out. Flair and the ladies freak out. Jimmy Hart tries his hardest to get Giant off Luger. Sting jumps the rail and tries to help out his buddy. And Gene tries to get a word, but Sting tells him to leave. Wild ending as we head into SLAMBOREE as the go home. Chaos, as we always talk about on Nitro. So again, this went directly against the NBA playoffs, so the ratings didn't do too great. Not in its normal time slot, but this was a great go home show for SLAMBOREE as we move towards the big pay-per-view with all these matches that we talked about. SLAMBOREE is an absolute monster of a show that we will be reviewing next week, and we're going to run down the full card as we go. But the big thing I want you guys to keep in mind is that the Giant has a big run here. He's going to continue his run as champion for a bit, and no one's going to unseat him. And when you make the rest of your roster, their offense looks like shit against him, you're running a huge risk. And keep in mind, he's a very young, very green wrestler here. So they're investing a big portion of their marketing, their TV presentation to the Giant. And it works out, I would say. He becomes a legitimate world champion. But it's easy to look at it now, as we talked about last week, that it's easy to look at now and say it worked out because he's a legend and he eventually becomes the Big Show, WWE Hall of Famer, all that. At the time, though, he's just a big guy, 20-something years old with no experience. So I give Bischoff a lot of credit to strapping the rocket to him because I think Big Show does a really good job here, or the Giant, I should say. Our final shot of nostalgia here for our double count out. WCW, do me a favor. Stop booking shitty endings. I think this is we might have to do like shots of beer or something because some of these shows, I'm sure they get a little crazy as far as DQs and no contest. But Mike Belcaster, I miss you. Taking the shot in honor of you. That will do it for Nitro. So we're going to do our chaser. I'll talk about my favorite match of the 2 episodes of Nitro. And we'll tell you why. And we'll close the tab. You guys ready for that? All right, so for the chaser, every week we'll pick our favorite part of the 2 nights of Nitro. So I will talk about my favorite match here. It was a tough choice because there was a lot of good wrestling to talk about. There was some good wrestling from top to bottom. Open the shows, we talked about some great matches. I'm going to have to go with the match between Sting and Steven Regal, just because of history's sake of how good these guys wound up being and how long they both continued to wrestle. This was a very good match. Again, went 6 minutes and 22 seconds, but honorable mentions has to be Demolenko versus Jushin Liger, the opening match from the second night of Nitro, as I got to take that banner off. Rick and Scott Steiner versus Public Enemy, and even the Chris Benoit versus Dave Taylor match. A lot of good wrestling here. some bait and switch stuff with that main event last week, but a lot of fun. And this is how you do a go-home show. There's a lot of good stuff on these 2 episodes of Nitro. And the crazy part is it's only getting better because we're about to get Scott Hall to infuse much needed enthusiasm into the product. And things are never going to be the same again. Like, this is the last time we're going to be seeing Nitro in 1996 or ever as the way it was. Because there's 2 eras of WCW, and that is pre-Scott Hall and Nash and then post-Scott Hall and Nash. And I would say WCW, for the most part in that era, was better because of when they came. They changed everything about the production. The reality was blurred. They did a really good job of presenting them as outsiders. Like, it's not just a moniker, not just a name that they gave them as a tag team. People truly believed that they were invading from WWF. And that is a fact. So people that didn't like WCW were tuning in because they thought they were helping WWF. It was a brilliant, brilliant marketing strategy without using their monikers, without using the likeness of Razor Ramon or the likeness of Diesel. It was a really good way to get the WWF stock or longevity of these characters onto your product, but with the realism that they're there to hurt you. It's just such a brilliant thing, because we want to talk about tribalism today with wrestling fans and how people feel. It existed back then, for sure. You liked what you liked. It was very hard for people to watch both because they aired at the same time. And there wasn't a DVR. You had to put a VHS. And there were people doing that for sure. But you either were a WWF person or a WCW person. And that line became blurred when WWF was a little bit boring. And when Scott Hall and Kevin Nash showed up and you felt like they were there for WWF, the line was very much blurred. So people feel like they had to tune in because they felt like they were supporting WWF. It was such a brilliant thing. So I can't wait to get into it next week, where we're going to be talking about Scott Hall showing up the day after SLAMBOREE, and things change for the better. Like, it's an absolute blast to go there and go back and watch this, because this is the time period of why we picked this time period. We have the stuff with Hogan at Bash at the Beach, but the lead up there is just so perfect. How they're hinting at the third man. People had no idea it was Hogan. No idea. Even Meltzer, who's as in tune as anybody else in the business, had no idea it was Hogan. And WCW didn't know it was Hogan just at this point. Nobody knew it was going to be Hogan. And nobody knew how big it was going to grow into, this NWO angle that absolutely changed the landscape of wrestling, changed the way things went, blew wrestling up to a space that we never thought it could have gone. And who would have thought, watching in the beginning, January 1996, to where they'd be at the end of the year, selling out the Georgia Dome with Goldberg in 1998, like where they got to. And I believe that Nitro, selling out a football stadium, was the height of WCW as far as popularity. Just to see where they were in front of hundreds of people, moving over to thousands of people, and it just changed the business. And it's so much fun to watch. So I can't wait to get into it. And again, next week, we're going to be talking about SLAMBOREE, but we'll talk about that in just a second. We're going to close our tab. The lights are coming on the bar. I'm by myself. It's kind of sad to be by yourself here at the bar, but we keep it running. The lights were on all night, tipping our bartenders, and just the same, we're going to close our tab and we're going to get out of here to start our weekend. All right, so we are closing our tab, and just to give you guys a final wrap-up of what's going on here in the Shot Nostalgia universe, next week's show is going to be July 1st, and we'll be talking about WCW SLAMBOREE 1996 and the follow-up Nitro from May 20th, 1996. So we are cruising through 1996. Keep in mind, episode 12 will be the next week, which is going to be, believe it or not, post 4th of July. It's crazy, we're already into July 8th. And we'll be reviewing the May 27, 1996 Nitro and the June 3rd Nitro. So before I do all the shilling again and show you guys all the turnbuckle stuff, I want to just read you guys the matches we are going to be having for SLAMBOREE. and there's a lot of them. So the opening match, Road Warrior Animal and Booker T versus Road Warrior Hawk and Lex Luger. We have Chris Benoit and the Taskmaster versus Public Enemy. We have Craig Pittman and Scott Steiner versus Rick Steiner and Booty Man. We have VK Wall Street and Jim Duggan versus the Blue Bloods, which is Steven Regal and Dave Taylor. We have Disco Inferno and Alex Wright versus Dick Slater and Earl Robert Eden. We have the Barbarian and Diamond Dallas Page versus Ming and Hugh Morris. We have Big Bubba Rogers and Stevie Ray versus Scott Norton and Ice Train. We have Ric Flair and Randy Savage versus Arn Anderson and Eddie Guerrero. We have Brad Armstrong versus Demolenko for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. We have another Lethal Lottery Tag Team match, Dick Slater and Robert Eden versus VK Wall Street and Jim Duggan. We also have Public Enemy versus Ric Flair and Randy Savage. DDP and Barbarian versus Rick Steiner and the Booty Man. Conan versus Juice and Thunder Liger for the U.S. Championship. We have the Battle Bowl to determine the number one contender to the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. And the main event, we have Sting versus the Giant for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. As I mentioned, 16 matches deep. So we're going to be here. Depending on the DQ finishes, depending on the no contest, depending on countouts, maybe taking a whole bunch of shots of nostalgia. Hop on board with us, guys. Pick your drink of choice. Next week, pop in there. Watch SLAMBOREE prior to getting in here so you guys know the event. Talk about it through and through. Maybe we'll do a therapy session because apparently the event was not a fun experience for some. But to me, it's great wrestling, man. Hopping in the time machine, the Wayback Machine, as we call it, and talking about wrestling, man. It's a lot of fun. Just to, again, get some shilling in here as well. Here by myself. I appreciate you guys watching this. I know this is not the format that we had promised, and Mike Bellcaster's not here, and I miss him terribly. He will be back next week when we're talking about some big events. But like I mentioned, we may be having some different guests pop on here. I've been sending out some feelers for people inside the tavern and outside the tavern to pop on Shot Nostalgia and have a conversation about their fandom in WCW and just maybe just watch an isolated episode of Nitro and discuss it with us. As I mentioned, if you liked what you saw, make sure to go to turnbuckletavern.com for more. You guys can check out all the different shows. We have a plethora of things that are going on here. Every single day of the week, we have something going on. Audio format or video, Twitch, TikTok is popping off, Facebook, and maybe just buy a shirt. Shot Nostalgia shirt goes a long way. That purple just pops, man. Buy some merch, support the tavern. As I said, guys, I appreciate you guys hanging out with me on a Friday. This is how we start our weekend. I hope you guys enjoy yourselves, enjoy the nice weather. Make sure you guys tip your bartenders. And most of all, myself and Mike Bellcaster. We'll see you next week.